We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Find the podcast at bookedonrock.com. Exclusive videos, blogs, links to all of the social media sites, the latest rock book releases, and links to all the listening platforms. Adam Steiner is a returning guest. His latest book is called Silhouettes and Shadows, The Secret History of David Bowie's Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. Steiner digs deep into this avant-garde pop album with new insights and exclusive interviews with close collaborators. He's here to share some of the stories behind the album and the tracks, which include the hit singles Fashion and Ashes to Ashes. Hear all of David Bowie's Scary Monsters and Super Creeps by visiting the show notes page. Adam, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to see you again.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, I had you on for your book on Nine Inch Nails.
Yeah, Into the Nether.
Yeah.
Which must be 2 years ago. It's gone really fast.
I think maybe a couple of years ago, maybe I had you on. Yeah, it's everything's a blur as you get older. So let's talk about this new book. And it's on David Bowie's Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. So what led you to writing the book on this specific album?
It's really interesting. I think in some respects, it's one of, if not my favorite Bowie album. I think it's in there like the 1, 2, 3 kind of thing, which constantly shifts and shuffles. And it wasn't entirely my gateway Bowie album. I kind of started more with Ziggy Stardust, and then I jump forward to Low and Heroes and things. So this came as something of an afterthought. The thing that really hooked it for me was that I had my first car. It had a tape deck, a cassette tape deck, not an 8-track, anyone. And I was in a charity shop or thrift store, and they had a cassette, and it was like £1.50 or something. And we're talking like 20 years ago. And I was like, yeah, great, another cassette for the car, David Bowie, brilliant. Bought it, and then just got really hooked on it. This mesmeric album that loops back on itself with the reprise of the opening track, and it's only like 10 songs long, but it's really tight, like 40 minutes. It's kind of like a classic record configuration. So yeah, in many ways, it's an album that defines Bowie, if not at his best, then at perhaps like one of his most adventurous phases, where he'd done so many varied things. He was able to bring together a lot of those conflicting elements from a really restless and energetic decade.
That's where I want to go next. You write, staring down the barrel of the 1980s, David Bowie faced an uncertain future that blurred feelings of optimism with old reflexes of fear and dread. Talk about where Bowie is at this point in his career and how that influences what he decides to do musically on Scary Monsters, because he should have been confident, you would think, and secure in his career, but that wasn't so. There was some inner conflict going on there.
Yeah, sure. I think it's one of those classic albums where it wasn't necessarily do or die, but he'd done so much in the previous 10 years that it was hard to know where to go from there. And obviously he was an artist committed to not repeating himself, making a point of, if not advancing, then zigging or zagging, if you will, from album to album. And 1980 is kind of quite a crucial year for him, because it was the year in which his divorce from his then estranged wife, Angie, was finalized. And she was there obviously from the Ziggy period, and was a really, whatever you might think of her personally, was a crucial figure in his career getting off the ground and becoming Ziggy Stardust. So that was a significant part of his personal history and personal disruption put to rest. He gained custody of his son, Zowie, Joe, who we now know as Duncan Bowie, the film director. And that was a really big thing for him, to have some kind of family unit or like that relationship with his son. And he also was almost completing the end of his recording contract with RCA record company, his label, who he'd been with for, more or less 10 years. And had a really, really strong run of successive albums. And despite, ups and downs in that relationship, like in 75, 76, they offered him a mansion in Philadelphia or something if he could just do Young Americans Part 2. And obviously Bowie balked at that and did Station to Station instead, which is, thank God for that, because that's like definitely one of his best albums. And so it was kind of a watershed thing. It's the end of one decade, the start of a new one, exciting new beginnings. But also he was for him, I think he felt he was getting older and life was getting a little bit harder to be competitive in the world of music as a chart contender, but perhaps also to be remain competitive with himself as an artist and still feel challenged, interested enough that he actually was engaged to continue making records. And also that's the time when he took on his first major acting role as John Joseph Merrick in the Broadway stage run of the Elephant Man play.
Yeah, there's an interesting connection there with the lyrics and the music too, which I wanted to ask you about. Yeah, what's also interesting is that you talked about how he's getting older, and I'm trying to recall how old he was at that time.
I believe he was 33.
33.
The same year as Jesus when he died.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he's obviously he doesn't want to repeat the past, but he's also cognizant of the fact that he needs to get an album out quickly. At least that's what he said. Because you're right. He's afraid that if he ever paused long enough for the dust to settle, that he would be considered a legacy act. If he waited too long, which I thought was interesting. He was only 33, but he was also concerned with that. Like, let's keep going. Let's keep things moving. We don't want to wait too long. Yeah,
I think because he had such an intense decade and went in different aspects, he went from success to success. It was hard for him to sit back for too long for fear that he might lose some of that momentum, that kinetic energy. And I think after 1980, he kind of did. He became a little bit listless, a little bit removed from the music, perhaps kind of making records for the sake of it without some of that initial spark that was there before. And so there was a strange tension there of like trying to be affirmative and remain a popular pop musician, which is kind of the name of the game of music, but once again to feel creatively challenged and engaged. Got to give credit and props to the artist who is responsible for that cover too, because it's an amazing cover. The artwork by Edward Bell. Yeah, it's a large scale collage, beautiful, great look to it. Which in the book cover, I like how you tie that in with the actual the book cover. I'm not sure who put that together for the book, but it's perfect. That's interesting. The photograph on the cover, I don't know if many of you actually realize this. It's not Bowie himself. It's a mannequin model of him looking a bit like a sort of heroes type pose with his arms stretched out forward at the waist, as if he's trying to carry something, some sort of invisible weight reaching out. I don't know. It's quite a lackluster kind of pose, but there's also maybe a slight sense of yearning to it. And that figure was actually commissioned by the photographer Masayoshi Sekita, who is a legendary Bowie photographer. Snapped many of the seminal shots of Bowie in the Ziggy Stardust era, and that's how they first got to know one another through, I think it might have been Japanese designer who was doing some of Bowie's crazier stage outfits, and that relationship continued all through their lives. And Sekita happened to be doing more photography with Bowie in Kyoto in 1980, around the time he was doing an advert there for a brand of sake. But the point is, it's a really haunting kind of figure because it looks real, but it's fake. And you can see it sort of slightly distressed, slightly falling apart. And I don't think it made it. I think it fell apart at some point, or it got lost. So it's no longer around. It's just Sekita's photographs of it. So yeah, it was kind of roughed up, disheveled beauty, elegance, perfection in the figure of the Pierrot clown, who is in some respects, in first glance, comical, fun, creative, open, but also sad, troubled, withdrawn. It's the cracked actor personified, perhaps. Let's go from visual now to what we hear on the album. It's produced by Tony Visconti, who said there was quite a bit of experimentation going on here. More parts were left out than included, he said. Talk about where this album was recorded
and how David approached the songs, because he was aiming for more pop-oriented music, but he also encouraged the musicians to explore and help determine where the songs would go.
It's a really interesting thing. I don't know if most people are quite aware of like just how quick, literally fast and intuitively Bowie worked in recording sections. A lot of his albums are more or less pieced together in 2 to 3 weeks, give or take. So very much spur of the moment, moving from idea to approach to interpretation, trying different things out. He often seems to have had an idea of what he wanted to make, how he wanted it to sound. In some respects, he couldn't necessarily facilitate that, as in he couldn't play perhaps the kind of riffs that he wanted on guitar, for example. He was much more of like a strumming acoustic rhythm guitarist kind of guy. And that was him having the Damn trio, Dennis Davis, Carlos Alomar on guitar, and George Murray on bass, to lay down the basics of the tracks and for them to just feed off of his energy and his ideas. Like that, slower, can you do it sadder? Can you draw this section out a bit? I think this could be more energetic or frenetic, and just little pointers and hints here and there. And before they know it, they had like basic tracks down. And that took, once again, like a matter of weeks. That was mostly recorded at the Power Plant studio in New York. Apparently a really great studio in New York. That was in like February of 1980. And then April, so a good month or so later, Bowie and Visconti met up again at Good Earth Studios in London, Visconti's own studio, and laid down the majority of the vocal tracks, and I think probably did some more overdubs and things. And in between all of that, you've got, Chuck Hammer on there with his synth guitar, and you've got Robert Fripp doing his wildly improvisatory guitar that seems freewheeling and off the chain, but is also like really rigorously disciplined and precise. And I love his ability to do that, to make really angry, energetic, powerful music, but to have a complete mastery over what he's doing. So when he does let go, it's almost as if he knows where he's going to end up, but it seems like some kind of chaos on the fretboard.
To me, yeah, he makes this album such a fun listen, Robert Fripp.
Yeah, and really rocky and really intense,
yeah.
Whereas he wasn't on something like Low. So, those tracks have some similar kind of energy, slightly more melancholy, slightly more downbeat. And as you say, I think there's a quote from Carlos Alomar who's saying like the ambition with this album that Bowie said to him was to kind of hit the listener right between the eyes. So really punchy, really tight, short, sharp songs. Nothing ambient, nothing that you would necessarily call electronica, apart from, stuff like Ashes to Ashes, sections of that. Everything kind of moving on. There's a lot of songs on there that could have been a single. For example, Teenage Wildlife, the great lost Bowie hit that never was. But it endures as a really strong, deep cut kind of ballad, comparable to Heroes.
The lead track, it's No Game #1 in parentheses. And David sings Draw the Blinds on Yesterday, and it's all so much scarier. I take that as he's no longer hiding behind the characters he creates in the 70s, and he's ready to introduce the real David Bowie, or David Jones for that matter, the real person to the world. What do you make of the song's lyrics?
Yeah, I think I like when Bowie throws out these really powerful, contradictory statements. They seem like an autobiographical declaration, but we're none the wiser, as you say. He's making this strange suggestion that you're obscuring something, but in doing so, it perhaps reveals some of the kind of truth because you're forced into self-reflection. You don't have the aura and the imagery and the spectacle to hide behind and to masquerade quite so easily. I really do wonder how much of the real David Bowie we get on this record, because we don't really get a character. We get from the cover we get Bowie as Piero, but it's partially revealed. It's like a torn curtain. So the blinds thing, I think you can take it, reasonably literally. And I also think it's him moving away from self-absorption, self-reflection, looking outwards more to the world and the state of things. So he's one of those great artists where he doesn't necessarily talk about exact specific events and times and places in great detail, but he casts his net wider and I think looks at more like the sensation, the emotional impact on the individual. So taking things from the the macro down to the micro, and that's really interesting. The way he funnels that down, because the songs remain really universal, but they also feel very intimate and connected. And you can see like his frustrations, his fears, his like mini panic attacks, and then his like elated feelings. They're not so unrelatable to the casual listener, I don't think.
And he's sparring vocal lines with a female voice speaking in Japanese. Interesting to read in the book. He initially intended to sing this part himself, but he wasn't. The phrasing didn't work out. Who is it we hear instead? And can you share a translation of what she says that you include in the book?
Yeah, sure. Her name is Mishi Hirota, and she was a girlfriend of one of the members of Sparks. I don't know if it was at that time. She was a friend of Visconti. She happened to be acting. I think she was acting in The King and I down the road, because his studio was in Soho, so not far from the theatre district of West Central London. And yeah, I think the idea was they got someone who could literally perform and give like oratorial backing to it, but to have it in a feminine voice. Bowie's argument is that that was some attempt at empowering the female and overturning the male chauvinistic hierarchy that they have in Japan, like in the West, but obviously driven more around discipline and cultural standing. And then in terms of the translations, it's really interesting because, like a lot of things, the lines don't translate perfectly, and so there's minute differences of interpretation you can take in them.
The translation is, I don't even want to try to pronounce it in Japanese, but I know one of them is, "I have been excluded from reality."
Yeah, and I think that relates actually to the "Draw the Blinds on Yesterday," and it's also much scarier. Maybe it's that one, but it's really weird. They come out sounding quite poetic, a little bit abstract, a little bit broken syntax, and it's odd. Like the translation, when you flip it back to the original lines, they seem to reveal other truths or deeper truths from Bowie's lyric. So I really enjoy that aspect of it, because obviously you weren't given the translation. You were perhaps supposed to interpret the vibe from the aggression and passion of the voice. It is really confusing once again, because there's a bit of a hall of mirrors effect where Bowie is saying to Mishi Hirota, "Sing it like a man." So it's a woman trying to overturn gender cliches and stereotypes and the balance of power by trying to sound more like a man. In theory, the guise and the attitudes that were keeping her down. So there's a strange sort of circularity to that. It's not necessarily a reversion, a revolution of power. It's perhaps a weird kind of feedback loop where the thing keeps going. But I just love the weird translations, because obviously they can be tweaked. Different people would translate those lines slightly differently. And there's great stuff in there around the idea of like being dominated by like a Superman type figure, like the political shift of authoritarianism. It kind of pushes the track a little bit harder than what Bowie was saying. And I love that, because it seems to just reveal more of the intent behind the song. So yeah, maybe that's why he never went forward and put out a definitive translation anywhere. He just let the Japanese stand on its own.
Yeah, just saying, Robert Fripp is on this track. He worked with Bowie on 1977's Heroes, right? That was the last time he had worked with him. It's very much like, I feel like a Rod Stewart, Jeff Beck type of thing there. I thought they would have made a great duo from there on out, but I don't think he ever worked with him again. And you do note in the book, some thought that his guitar work on this album stood out too much, which I don't agree with.
Yeah.
Too confrontational, right? That was some of the criticism.
Yeah, it's almost like customer feedback, because it's a really aggressive, hyped up record. I love the things like Because You're Young, Teenage Wildlife. They're really like hyped up, over dramatic, melodramatic, really. But you can't help but be swayed by the romanticism of that, even if it is a bit tortured and jaded. So there's still some of the old, very camp, silly, almost cabaret showiness of like Ziggy Stardust era, really, which is kind of there all the way through Bowie's stuff, to be fair. And he never really apologized for that or feels he has to rein it in. But when you look at aspects of Low and Heroes here and there, they're a lot more icy and austere and withdrawn. But the inclusion of Fripp there seems quite liberating, and I just think his guitars sound brilliant, really aggressive. They're really high in the mix, and they seem to sort of like rub up against the song sometimes. But Bowie had this like willingness for a really well produced record. Visconti talks a lot about where he took individual pieces of tape and tweaked the snare sound and phased it and all this kind of stuff. It's in that sense, it's quite an electronic-y album. Everything's warped and distorted and, fits into the monsterish vibe. And Fripp's guitar perhaps speaks to that, vocalizes some of that. But yeah, the fact that it's way in there in the song also makes it a really rocky kind of album that you wouldn't quite hear that kind of thing again until, to an extent, Tin Machine, but, more specifically things like 1997's Earthling. Reeves Gabrel's guitars are really on top of the songs there and really blazing, powerful distortion. So it's a rare kind of thing that Bowie does there, but he makes the record that is really polished and nuanced sound really raw and fierce. And I really enjoy that.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
I take the Wayfarers off and hand them to him. Maybe I really did kill a Solly. Though I'm positive that any cab drivers I've killed lately were not American. I probably did. There probably is a wanted poster of me at... where the taxi, the place where all the taxis congregate. What's it called? The driver tries the sunglasses on, looks at himself in the rearview mirror, and then takes them off. He folds the glasses and puts them in his jacket pocket. "You're a dead man," I smile grimly at him. "And you're a yuppie scumbag," he says. "You're a dead man, Abdullah." I repeat, no joke. "Count on it." "Yeah, and you're a yuppie scumbag. Which is worse?" He starts the cab up and pulls away from me. While walking back to the highway, I stop, choke back a sob. My throat tightens. "I just want to..." Facing the skyline through all the baby talk, I murmur, "Keep the game going." As I stand, frozen in position, an old woman emerges behind a 3-penny opera poster at a deserted bus stop, and she's homeless and begging, hobbling over, her face covered with sores that look like bugs, holding out a shaking red hand. "Oh, will you please go away," I sigh. She tells me to get a haircut. "Oh, hi there. You caught me reading a hateful story. How bigoted of you." Actually, that was a section from American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, a book that has been very controversial since before its publication, being rejected by publishers all over the world, and demonized by many who have never even read it, and are therefore unable to see it as the black comedy and poignant satire that it is. Here at Screaming Eye Press, we are committed to freedom of expression in all its forms. This is why we have created Horrible Little Stories. Stories they don't want you to read. A collection of horror and dark fantasy stories by Joe Lansdale, Gary Reiser, Elizabeth Massey, Jack Dan, Richard Christian Matheson, G. Wayne Miller, Ray Garton, A.J. Lance, and more. All proceeds will be donated to the anti-censorship organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or the FIRE, found at thefire.org. What is freedom of expression? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist. Salman Rushdie. And if we've offended you with this commercial, then just turn it off for fuck's sake.
Up the Hill Backwards, the next track, there's a push and pull between a Bo Diddley shuffle in 7/4 time and some melodic pop sections. You do note in the book that Bowie's video for Let's Dance 3 years later was a continuation of the gauntlet thrown down by Up the Hill Backwards. What did you mean by that?
Interesting. Bowie talks so often about the album in terms of commitment. So he's saying we're all individuals. And, he was such a profoundly individualistic person. He lived a weird, sort of isolated lifestyle as a rock star. And a lot of his earlier songs, he says this himself, deal very much with alienation. It's him withdrawn inward, reflecting that outwards. A lot of songs are quite dark, almost depressing, melancholy, apocalyptic so often. And then when it comes to Scary Monsters and Up the Hill Backwards, he's looking at the idea of like, yes, you are an individual and you have your own rights and your liberty, and that's really important. That should never be taken away from you. But ultimately, we are all, even if it's indirectly, invested in society. For me, it kind of verges on a little bit of like socialism, communist kind of awareness that he suddenly seems to realize that no man is an island, no person is not, if you like, and we all have like, if not a part to play, then we're all connected, and there's a shared investment, and there's taking from society, but there should also be some giving back, and that could even just be, exchanges of kindness and awareness of other people's needs and difference and identity. So I think on this album, he takes that really strongly, even though he's often mocking, sarcastic, frustrated, he's throwing his hands up. Like, I really struggle. I think things are really fucked. I don't have the answers, but we are all involved. Our inaction still counts as a contribution to the problems that we fail to address or challenge. And so it makes his push for commitment, or at least just an awareness of that in the social political realm, comes back to a push against authoritarianism that would have everyone the same, that would have things controlled, that would punish minorities. He's taking a stand, but it's also a very dejected, thwarted, troubled position, because he's not the leader of a revolution. He doesn't have all the answers, but I think he's exposing himself that bit more, that he is aware of the world's ills. He does care, but like so many of us, he perhaps feels cursed by indecision.
He had an amazing observation of the world around him, but he was also very upfront and honest about what was going on inside of him, like the title track, which is, to me, sounds like a guy who was becoming unhinged. As you put it, the song offers us a record of a restless and troubled mind. And this is where the Elephant Man connection comes in. Talk about Bowie's influences for this specific track, like the 1932 cult film Freaks and John Merrick, known as the Elephant Man, where the quote-unquote normal people are actually the villains. After all, if you look at it in that way, they're the ones who are casting out those who aren't normal.
Yeah, it feeds into directly into the title track, as you say, Scary Monsters, Super Creeps. And Bowie, in an interview, I forget what the show's called. It's something like Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. It's an interview show. It's an ATN. He's talking about, where did you get the inspiration for the title of the album? And he's like, it's some Kellogg's, cornflakes packet or something, and the kid gets a free toy, and it's like Superman and Nosferatus. And the theory is that's not quite accurate. There might be something else, but that was the reason and the logic he gave. And when you look at his involvement and the deep seriousness with which he engaged with the Elephant Man role on Broadway, the amount of preparation and just consideration he gave to it, once again, I think it's Bowie highlighting shared vulnerabilities and encouraging a mutual awareness of people being exposed and having their identities questioned. And the measure of a society could often be considered kindness or the sense of justice with which it treats its weakest or most vulnerable members, who are perhaps the most excluded and need the most help. So moving against perhaps like the more conservative tradition of self-reliance and hard individuality, each person looks after their own affairs, and then we happen to bump up against one another in the social sphere. But Merrick is obviously a person who was disabled, faced extreme difficulty in life, often shunned, mocked, and the thing that Bowie tries to manifest in his role was his mime training. So contorting his body rather than using makeup and things, contorting his body to have the experience or to project the experience of deformity and lack of mobility and ugliness, but to highlight what he calls Merrick had a fine mind. And it wasn't that he was necessarily a genius or anything, but he was deeply sensitive. He was empathetic towards the needs and plights of others, despite the many difficulties he faced himself.
Yeah, his beauty was on the inside. The ugliness was on the outside. Way of putting it. And the rest of the world, it was the reverse.
Yeah, and he was articulate. And so it was the call for people not to be judged on either case exclusively, but perhaps be taken as a whole considered individual, though they might be lacking in some areas. They had other things to offer. And on that basis, people like Joseph Merrick, Elephant Man, was not a subject to be pitied, but someone who needed support, guidance, perhaps kindness, to be elevated and lifted up to achieve their potential. And, Merrick met all these people. He inspired to some extent and influenced them with his grace, putting up with, the immense difficulties he faced in daily life. And that was his kind of inner strength. And I think Bowie really respected that and tried to bring it out in the role.
Ashes to Ashes, #1 single in the UK. Should have been #1 in the US. I'm not sure why it wasn't. It's number 79 in the US Cashbox Top 100. I'm not sure what that, I guess that's kind of like the Billboard Hot 100 these days. On this, we hear Roy Bittan on piano. This is a cool story. He came into the studio after just a chance meeting between the guys in the band at the Power Station studio cafeteria. And he had worked with Bowie before, though. He was on Station to Station. So how did they get that ping-ponging sound on his piano?
It's slightly complicated, but Visconti talks about, I think, putting it through a flanger, but also putting it through some kind of recording the sound out through like a rotating speaker or something to give it that strange, watery, shimmery kind of effect, which, Ashes to Ashes, mainly because of the video, I guess, but perhaps in some of the imagery, has this weird coastal sea sort of vibe. So it's the land, the elements of land versus water pushing back and forth, eating away at one another. So I think it makes some of that theme very literal. And obviously the song's so much about voyaging, being lost in space, isolation again, and the fact that for all the aspiration and intellectual striving of things like the space race, that still human existential concerns remain, and Major Tom ends up lost, dejected, alone, helpless. So he kind of carries his problems with him as much as you can try and travel and escape them.
Adam Steiner is here to talk about his brand new book, Silhouettes and Shadows, The Secret History of David Bowie's Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. In Ashes to Ashes, we hear David mention Major Tom. The lyric, Ashes to Ashes, funky to funky, we know Major Tom's a junkie, strung out in heaven's high, hitting an all-time low. He later sings, my mother said, to get things done, you'd better not mess with Major Tom. What is David trying to convey here with these mentions of Major Tom?
It's a good question. I think off the cuff, it's the easy connection between the first David Bowie album proper, which has his initial flop / hit / one-hit wonder Space Oddity, in which Major Tom's introduced and he goes up into space, and it's the kind of trendy space race song that Bowie did, and then bringing that back down to earth, if you will, that Tom has been up in space all this time, isolated, lost, perhaps stuck in some kind of addiction. It all gets embroiled in this really quite complex, winding metaphor that you can cut different strands from it and see that that's the trajectory of the plot. But it all compounds into this, like I said, this theme of isolation. And you get the sense it's Bowie looking back at addiction and the struggles to get clean, to stay clean, the need for the crutch and the reliance upon drugs to be in an altered state to avoid the harsh difficulties of reality. So in that sense, it works as a really good metaphor. And the obviously the line about you better not mess with Major Tom, it suggests something about if you're going to go down that road of becoming seriously involved in drugs, you have to be prepared for the responsibility and the risks that it can get on top of you and then dominate your life, rather than you using a drugs as a way to augment your life or to heighten your imaginative or sensory perception. So it's kind of like a warning from history, and it's already sort of too late. It's already happened to Bowie. And what I like about something like Ashes to Ashes, and you see this with other artists like Nine Inch Nails and like the Hesitation Marks album from 2013, looking back on a problem which for Bowie was just a few years ago, of moving from cocaine addiction to alcohol and then eventually becoming clean towards 1980. So part of the new start is that while you become clean, you're no longer an addict and you don't do anything like that anymore. You stay away from addictive recreational substances and alcohol. You forever remain trapped in your vulnerability of relapse, but also you can never, the reason you get clean is to save your life, protect your family, have a future free of drugs. You can never deny or forget those experiences. They stay with you. The trauma is cumulative. The wounds have healed. They remain scars. All these kind of analogies you want to throw at it. But it never actually goes away. It remains a real thing, to the extent that it's psychologically perhaps almost like an open wound. There you go. I laid it on really thick.
That's a good one. I like it. Good answer. Good answer. Yeah, and he could have been an early casualty of drugs for sure. He had really reached a rock bottom prior to the 1980s. The next track, Fashion, finishes outside one, number 5 in the UK, 70 in the US. Guitarist Carlos Alomar noted that Fashion had its musical roots in Fame, itself adapted from the riff to the Flares' 1961 track Foot Stompin'. David would say it wasn't a political song, but the lyrics had others feeling differently. The lyrics turn to the left, turn to the right, and reference to the Goon Squad had some interpreting it to be about fascism. Is he drawing an analogy between fashion and fascism here? What's your interpretation of the lyrics?
I think so. There's my restrained answer. I feel he's playing with it, and that's part of the great fun of the song. It's really good, fun, danceable thing about being one together with other people on the dance floor, just losing yourself, engaged with the song to the rhythm. It's all about having fun and forgetting big, heavy, real world concerns. At the same time, it's also a song that is quite perhaps satirical, sarcastic, throwing out, he teases the line, fashion, and you almost feel he's going to trip over and say fascism or fascist, which, he makes a reference to in It's No Game, and it's looking back to his notorious return to the UK in 76, where he makes a wave from his open-top Mercedes-Benz, and everyone's like, he did a Sieg Heil Hitler salute. Oh my God, World War II is barely just over. And I think he's sort of taking the piss out of the listener and his critics at the same time. And I think his real target is not necessarily pure politics. It's more about character, identity, class, the British culture of being reserved and withdrawn and sticking to your lines, having your sharp divisions of lower, middle, and upper. Whereas in America, I understand it, aside from like political philosophy, in America, I think the divisions are more straightened, where it's more about how much money you do or don't have, and that partly can equate your standing in society. Whereas, the arrogance of British culture, for example, is that we go back to old Europe, hundreds of years. Who are your family? Where are they from? What did they do? And then there's inherited wealth and inherited title and inherited reputation for something that, maybe happened 500 years ago or more, when your ancestor was a knight and did a good deed. And I think he's just kicking back against that, kicking against the barbs of the arrogant pricks in their middle-class enclaves who are so determined to look after themselves and maintain their station and potentially one day climb the social ladder, that they forget about other people adjacent to them. They try to ignore and reject people who are different to them because they fear change shifting under their feet and losing their own position, and obviously kicking down the rungs of the ladder beneath them as they climb up.
I have to believe too he was influenced by being in New York and the fashion world in New York, right? I mean, I think that just created that. All of those thoughts went through his head. I could see him at one of those fashion shows where all the models come walking out. They all look the same, expressionless face, and I think all that stuff was stirring in his head. At least that's my thought. I don't know if he was. For sure.
The groove in the song is just kind of relentless. Right. It's a bit krautrock. It's marching. You make a good point about the models. Actually, it's the idea of homogeneity, or at least fitting in. So the benefit of fitting in is that I'm an individual, but I'm an individual like these people. These are my tribe.
You have to you have to be the same weight, the same height, the same look. You have to dress the same. You have to have the same look.
And as a metaphor, that really works because it gives people strength and security and mutual identity.
And as we know, David was big into fashion. He loved,
to a point,
sharp, but at the same time, he was not going to be one of those like fall in line with the rest. But he did appreciate the look, looking cool.
I guess you could say he was against hardcore fashion as like the industrialization of creativity. There you go. So ideas, art, imagination being put into product,
Yeah.
which is kind of what records are. You know, there's a lot of syntheticness to music, especially pop music, but there's always something. Ideally, there should always be something knowing and arch and self-aware that you can also be subverting that system while making a really fun, groovy song like Fame or Fashion.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Teenage Wildlife, longest track on the album, almost 7 minutes, and it's structurally similar to his song Heroes. Is David reflecting on his younger self here? Because some feel he takes a shot at his imitators, most notably Gary Newman, who had a #1 single, Cars, and he was overhyped as the Bowie of the 80s. So is he taking a little shot at him? Is he also reflecting on his younger self here in this song?
It's a really good point. I think one of the great things about it, he's trying to level himself out and saying, look, despite some people think I'm a global superstar, and I kind of am, I'm also like a strict individual. I maintain my own character, my own position, my own private person behind the persona, which is constantly shifting anyway. So if you can't delineate between the two, the mask and the person behind it, then you're perhaps buying too much into the pop world myth. And I think Newman is a great example of someone who Bowie could potentially have a beef with and to beat a stick at. But obviously there's loads of other people who were directly inspired by him and in turn inspired Bowie. So it became kind of reciprocal to the extent that, I think sometimes he was stealing aspects from their work, which had initially been inspired by him. So perhaps it's righteous theft, redistribution. So examples, something like he talks a lot about, he's in his notes, like Joy Division in terms of the Scary Monsters album. And like he talks about there's a note like Get on Top of Dennis Davis drum. And it's like the sort of phased snare sound that Joy Division had, particularly on the first album, Unknown Pleasures, and things like She's Lost Control. And a band that were really, really inspired by Bowie and the Berlin records. And then he's sort of saying, I really like the effect they used on their stuff, I'll take that. So it's a really weird kind of synthesis of cycling influence there. And he's probably hyper aware of that, but also not something you want to readily admit to because you want to be seen as a resolute artist in your own right. And so I think there was maybe some anxiety and nervousness about acknowledging his own debts in turn. But also, I think he's trying to abdicate from responsibility and the idea that he's the king or god of anything or any kind of scene. He's like, I don't want to be new wave or no wave, but I'm just David Bowie. That's my thing. So I'm not part of anyone else's movement, and there is no new David Bowie because there's only me. So it's weird. He's kind of like drawing a line in the sand, but also saying, I don't want people to try and cross this because I can't tell you how I did it. I can't tell you or explain it away because it's art. You can talk about it, but explaining it too much, you potentially kill it, which is why I wrote a 300-page book about the album.
Yeah.
And it's just the risk of trying to overanalyze what you do. You can't necessarily put it into words. It's just something that comes naturally to you, that you work really hard at, and it's just what you do, just to make it happen.
Yeah, and while there's a lot to pull apart and try to put back together and make sense of lyrically, also we got some really cool, as we've mentioned before, some really cool things they do sonically and on Screams Like a Baby. There's some cool effects on David's voice on this, and it's another Frankenstein's monster of a song. It's recycled from other tracks. And you talk about this one and some of the things they do, the studio technology that they take advantage of on this.
Yeah, in terms of what you were saying about an old song rejiggered, there's quite a bit of that on this album and across, lots of Bowie albums where sometimes stuff from like 10 years ago jumps back. So you've got like the I think it's like 1970 demo of Tired of My Life becomes, some of the lyrics from that, just a few choice lines, become kind of the backbone of the spirit of It's No Game. And then with Scream Like a Baby, the title, chant, Scream Like a Baby. He originally had his soul trio, the Astronets, envisaged with his girlfriend backing singer in 74, Ava Cherry. And he had some tracks written for them, demoed, and one of them was I Am a Laser. And it's a little bit like some of Young Americans' joustery fashion stuff that he would do in 75. But at that time, he he has this song and the chorus follows the same melody, and it's "I am a laser burning through your mind," and it's like
Wow.
now you're kind of like, well, that's crap because I love "Scream Like a Baby," but that was once again that was like the core melody of the chorus, and it just kind of got slotted straight into the new song. So it's pretty amazing how he brought things back like that. And as a song, it's again a lot of voice warping, a lot of monsterishness, monstrosity, and in some ways it seems to tell quite a horrific story of like persecution, people being tortured, locked away, denied their rights, a ghost of the civil dead, as they say. And it's quite a horrific vision of like an authoritarian future, and really easy to look back at Bowie's influences of 1984 in so many songs.
And I believe this is the one too where you hear like his voice go, the pitch gets turned way up. I think it's on this track.
Yeah. And he has this like continued rant and talking about like swearing in the backseat of a car, and you just imagine someone being taken away by the secret police, and then locked in a room. And what I love about it, it has that nice twist that 1984 has, where people are encouraged to inform and turn against one another and to break the bonds of something like love. And that's the ultimate failure and treason against our own humanity, to reject the ennobling things of our like purer, better selves, if you like.
There's a John Lennon connection or influence on David Bowie that you hear on this album too. Kingdom Come, the track that follows. And you write that this song shares similar feelings with John's song God with the Plastic Ono Band. Can you talk about that connection and other areas where you hear Lennon's influence on this album?
So it's a cover of Tom Verlaine's song of Television, if you ever heard Marquee Moon, and it's from his first solo album, and it's Verlaine seems to be sort of railing against God, but knowing that eventually the hammer of God some kind of justice will come down upon him for a sinful life. That's my broad interpretation. And Bowie seems to follow the original actually very closely. At first I thought he didn't, but he just comes in more with like his kind of like booming Ronnie Spector impression voice. It's a little bit Wall of Sound. I find it, some people find it really overblown, but I find it a really enjoyable song. Once again, given that it's kind of bleak, it's almost like seems like an existential quandary about like being bound to religion, even if you're personally against religion, because the sense of God's omnipotence and his all-seeing eye will always find you out. Even if you're a sinner, there is no escape from God's domain, perhaps. And so life becomes a bit of a prison. And then also there's the idea that Lennon, when he sings God from Plastic Ono Band in 70, 71, I forget, really big influence on the record in general, like vocal style and things. There's just such a powerful choice line, is it, where Lennon said, God is the concept by which we measure our pain. Mm-hmm. And so it's the idea that even if God wasn't real, we still beat ourselves up by imagined moral codes and rightness and wrongness, where if you want to take like a Nietzschean aspect to it, sometimes meekness and pity are seen as more powerful virtues than independence, being a strong character. It's very difficult to interpret Nietzsche clearly on these points, but it's the idea that Christianity can possess quite subversive, undermining cruelties while trying to be the bearer of greater virtue and killing people with kindness, for example, and hypocrisy, where the religiously free person who denies religion can make informed, independent choices on a case-by-case basis, rather than sticking to the scripture of what is a book that may be based upon certain true events and true people, but also seem to have a lot of like creative padding, the Bible. And yeah, being bound to those codes is not necessarily a freeing and informed way of living. It's a really fun song.
Yeah, it is a great tune. There isn't a bad song on the album, actually. We mentioned he was 33 when he made the album Scary Monsters, and he not only had quite a bit of experience with now being famous and dealing with the music, the business side of music, But he had some love scars there too. He was married in 1970 to Mary Angela Barnett. And they had, you mentioned this before, they had a son, Duncan, who was born in 71. And it was an open marriage, but it didn't work out. They divorced in 1980. And right around the time he starts recording Scary Monsters is when the divorce, I think the proceedings begin or end. But on the track, Because You're Young, he sings, because you're young, you'll meet a stranger some night. Because you're young, what could be nicer for you? And it makes me sad, so I'll dance my life away. A million dreams, a million scars. Is he warning young lovers, or does he envy them? Because I wonder which one it is. Because I wonder when he says there are a million dreams, yet a million scars.
Yeah. Can we be really didactic and say that it's both?
Right. Could it be both?
You know, that once again, another classic Bowie contradiction.
I mean,
like
isn't that the whole risk of falling in love, right? That's the whole risk.
I guess the curse of the younger lovers, is that everything is new and it's this amazing, profound, wonderful experience. So it will always perhaps seem with hindsight as the most important, the most righteous, if you like, love that people have experienced because it was new and it was the first time and so on. And then no other love can necessarily compare with that. But that could be the very thing that kind of clouds you at the time into thinking this is something brilliant and amazing, but it's simply that you're inexperienced and you don't necessarily know what love means, which obviously includes things like patience, God help us, and sacrifice and kindness and compromise and all those kind of like give and takes that people have to have an enduring relationship with someone. It can't just be based purely upon attraction, all the good stuff, because with the good stuff comes naturally occurring bad stuff and real life shit. So yeah, it's there's a wistful melancholy to it. And so perhaps it's a warning, once again, a bit like Teenage Wildlife, against that willful naivety, but also if there's a sense of slight jealousy, cheering them on, good for you, I was young once, all that kind of stuff. And it, you know, I think for all kinds of listeners, it makes it really powerful. If you were younger, it's perhaps the inspiration of like, yes, this powerful feeling of being swept off your feet. That's what love is like. And then the older listener being like, yeah, love is amazing, but wait till you've had your heart broken, and then you'll never want to fall in love ever again.
Right.
By definition.
Because you're young, it's so euphoric, but it's because you're young that you have no idea what you're in for. Yeah. The album finishes with It's No Game #2. And here we have melancholy in David's delivery, which his range in this album is also something to be noted. It's melancholy as opposed to the fury on the opening track. Tony Visconti says it's the exact same backing track as #1. It's just altered, slowed, adjusted with some various effects. And he used mixing and different overdubs to make it sound removed from the original version. And this is what you write in the book. Quote, the song appears to conclude the reel of current affairs programming through the lens of a video nasty introduced with It's No Game #1. We are seeing late night repeats of the horror, inhabiting the inertia of the spectator. Like them, we have seen too much and turned into the same semi-visible figures, crouched in shadow, frozen into silhouettes. Beautifully written. And in the first It's No Game, we hear a tape winding up in a frenzy. With #2, it's playing out, and you can hear it snapping.
Running to the end.
Yeah. Only this, it slows to a halt. What do you make of the album's ending track? Is this a man who has purged and released the monsters of his past? Is he exhausted but ready for a new phase?
That's a really good question. I always struggle with it. I like, the first one, the first It's No Game is so powerful, so intense. It kind of like blows your head off, and it's like, oh my God, he's screaming and then he's singing and he's whooping and yelling. It's like, and it's like dive bombing guitar and stuff. It's just crazy. And then it's something of a come down. It's something of a letdown. And maybe that was the point. Maybe it was to show the flip side of the hype, where it's resignation and defeatism and melancholy and sadness and the realities of struggle that kick back against you when all your revolutionary zeal and things are gone. And so in that sense, it is actually powerful. And perhaps it's necessary, like you said, with the tape metaphor that Visconti puts in, to conclude the album properly and balance things out a little bit, because so much of it is quite melancholy, but also just so extreme and erratic, as you say. Bowie going all over the place and quite fragmented imagery. Not many of the songs are entirely that neat and clear and unambiguous, right? So maybe it's the great leveler that the album needed. And it's fascinating to wonder like what he might have ended or how he might have ended it otherwise. Because there's quite a lot of like, especially the first half. A lot of people say like, I prefer the first half, and I'm like, for fuck's sake, like it's an album, you need to kind of just listen to it through, like embrace the other stuff as like genuine deep cuts, even though they're not quite so out there or thrilling or confrontational, rough and smooth, whatever. But yeah, maybe it's the necessary part to conclude that, because otherwise, where would Bowie go with it? But it gives it the strength. It's just 10 tracks, all Bowie albums are short and they usually have a cover. It's a really unique thing about him. It's weird. His albums are quite succinct, and it's really well measured. It's really balanced. It's really nicely paced, despite the extremity at the start. Perhaps the second side takes you a bit deeper and is perhaps more open and less rough and obstructive, but it's a really short, sharp record. It's a classic thing of like, for me, a classic record is like 10, 12 songs tops, and about 40 minutes or so. It's kind of perfect.
Yeah, 45 minutes, 37 seconds, according
to... and it like doesn't outstay its welcome. It's not indulgent. There's no instrumental ambient things on here, even though it's believed Crystal Japan, that I alluded to earlier, the great like B-side, was recorded at the same time. Bowie's like, it just doesn't fit. There's nowhere for it to go. It would actually really fuck up the album to be on there. And people would be like, oh, is he doing Low and Heroes again, half and half or whatever? It just doesn't, it's a great song. It's fantastic. I love it, but it doesn't really make sense on the album. So he had to go somewhere with it. And perhaps his truly revolutionary thing was to flip the song back on itself and reprise it,
Well,
the Beatles did.
Yeah.
Revolution.
Reading the book, like I said before, just a whole new appreciation for the album, and I gave it a listen from start to finish. And you do listen to it differently once you get into what is it that David Bowie's saying here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he wants you to guess and forever be contemplating it and trying to figure out what it is. You could listen to this album 10 years from now and think differently than you're thinking about it now, or that you did 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to look at it.
Yeah.
Nothing's resolved. There aren't definitive answers. You get a lot from it. You can't always exactly say what that is, but you're like, oh, it really moves me and it inspires me and it challenges me. And it's like, if you can say that about an album, it's got a lot going for it.
The sign of a great artist.
Yeah, other people are like, oh, it has really good tunes and I can do this. I'm nodding my head for listening. Like a little dog. Yeah. And like, but it can't all just be that way, because life isn't like that way. And like, how would the record have deep universal appeal that relates to reality and fantasy, and where those two things collide,
Yeah, the book is out now. Silhouettes and Shadows, The Secret History of David Bowie's Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. It's out through Backbeat Books, available wherever you get your books. A link to purchase a copy in the show notes page. And where can people find you online, Adam?
Best place is via my website, www.adamsteiner.uk.
Easy enough. Adam, thanks for being on. I looking forward to having you back on again soon down the road.
Great. Thank you, Eric.
That's it. It's in the books.